Hey guys, we hope that the following message will be a blessing to you. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell. You can also follow us on Facebook at Newland Street Church of Christ. We live stream our services every Sunday morning at 10 and every Wednesday night at 7 Pacific Standard Time. We really hope that you can join us together in worshiping our Creator. Now, on to the rest of the video.
Thank you, Alan, for reading from the Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. That theme of faith is going to be relevant tonight, so I hope we can all keep that in mind. Not only the theme of faith, but also the theme of fear. And so I want to start off by asking you guys a question. What scared you when you were a child? I want to hear some stuff about that. Sorry? The Blob, okay. I know what it is. It's from a movie, a classic, yes. And there's a remake, so I'm not completely oblivious. I'm just surprised, okay. Okay, The Blob, what else? Lagatha, go ahead. Dracula, okay. Now we're talking. No, go ahead. Connie, you had another one? Or you had one? Wooden spoons. Oh, okay. That took me a second too. All right. Go ahead. The Grinch. Okay. That makes sense. It's not the most pleasant of characters. Frankenstein. Very good. Dolls. Yeah, that's a good one. I can agree with that. Steve McQueen's acting in The Blob. All right. That'll keep you up at night. Go ahead, Deanne. Okay, The Wicked Witch of the West from Wizard of Oz. And the monkeys. I heard my mom would talk about how scary those monkeys were. Yeah. You had another one?
I was also afraid of sharks.
Okay, sharks. I can relate to that. I'm terrified of sharks. You watch the movie Jaws and you can never get back in the water quite the same way, can you? That's me. I'll give you one that I was afraid of as a kid, kind of. My family misunderstands it, but I was afraid of the Easter Bunny as a child. And I don't mean the literal Easter Bunny. I was afraid of the guy in the suit at the mall, okay? There was one particular Easter that we were staying with some friends, and my mom and my older brother were off at Lads to Leaders, which would happen Easter weekend. We weren't old enough yet to go and be a part of that. So I was a little kid, and they took us James and I, to the mall to pose with the Easter Bunny, right? And I knew it was a guy in a suit. It didn't matter how many times I said that. The friends who were keeping us, they didn't believe me that I actually thought that. Anyway, this guy was weird. He was trying to get a rise out of us, I guess, trying to make us interesting for the picture and make us laugh, but we did not like it. He was just, awkward in a way we didn't like. So that night, it was either a nightmare or I woke up and I saw one of our friends, and it must have been his fuzzy slippers or something. But I could have sworn the Easter Bunny was walking down the hall that night. And anyway, I told everybody the next day. And I meant it was the guy in the suit, but they didn't believe me. They thought from then on I was afraid of the actual Easter Bunny, because that's real. All right, so anybody else? Go ahead.
When I was a kid, I was afraid of Santa Claus.
Okay. You're afraid of Santa Claus as a kid. Okay. Anybody else? Anything? Go ahead. Snakes. That's a good one, because we can still be afraid of snakes today, right? So we're going to be talking about fear tonight in the text that that we're assigned with tonight. This is a survey class, and it's probably never going to feel more like a survey class than tonight, because we're going to be looking at quite a few verses. We're going to be looking at basically all of chapter 5 plus a few verses in chapter 4 of the book of Mark. And all of these stories have to deal with fear and faith, and kind of the interesting relationship that works between these two things. So let's remember one more time where we're at in the story of Mark. We're in Act 1, meaning that we're asking the question, who is Jesus? And that question is going to receive some very profound answers tonight in this particular chapter. Because as we've been going through this book, if imagining we're reading it for the first time, we've been wondering, and we've been given little clues, right? He has powers, he has interesting teachings, but it's tonight that this question starts really hitting overdrive. Because now Jesus, he's not only going to show some power, he's going to show enormous, immense power over all kinds of things that we might be afraid of. So let's go ahead and start in chapter 4, verse 35. Chapter 4, verse 35. It says, "On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side.' And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and the other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Peace, be still.' And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, 'Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?' And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" So we're going to find out in the next section where they're headed across the Sea of Galilee here. They're going into a Gentile area called the Decapolis, which means 10 cities. I think it's this idea in Mark that Jesus is entering into strange and scary lands. We'll certainly see that it's scary once they get to the other side. But even as they're traveling across the Sea of Galilee, it's scary because a storm arises. And from what I understand, based on the geography, these sudden swells would have been common because of the mountains that surrounded this basically large lake. And so this was common. But I think we can tell from the reaction of many of the disciples here, many of whom were fishermen, I think we can tell from their reaction that this was no ordinary storm, right? This is quite hectic. And yet, even in the midst of all this crazy storm, where the boat is flooding, it says Jesus is asleep on the stern. Think about that. The boat is flooding, and he's asleep on the cushion. I think that's pretty striking. It's only in the book of Mark that we're given this little tidbit of information, that Jesus is actually on a cushion in the stern. And that, once again, adds to this idea that this is kind of a first-hand account of Peter, right? You can almost imagine that it's Peter going to Jesus and shaking him awake and asking, don't you care, right? How can you still be asleep? I just imagine him almost in a puddle of water, right? How can you still be sleeping through this? And so far in the story, has anyone noticed any similarities to a famous Old Testament book? Yeah, Jonah. So what are the similarities here to Jonah? Okay, so in the story of Jonah, he's asleep on a boat, right? And there's a storm raging, and the passengers, they wind up throwing him overboard because Jonah, well, long story short, they find out it's Jonah's fault, right? So there is this idea of miraculous, the storm going still miraculously. There's a guy asleep during the storm. Any other similarities to that story? Yeah, they're the ones going to wake him up. Anything else? I think one contrast that you could say is that Jesus here, he's on his way to the Gentiles. He's on his way to the Gentile land. He's willing to go and preach to the people that Jonah wasn't willing to go to, right? So it's almost like Jesus is being presented here as a better Jonah, a better prophet than Jonah, right? Any other things that make you think of that particular book? So Jesus, he wakes up and he rebukes the wind. Before saying anything to the disciples, he rebukes the wind, and everything complies. The forces of nature comply. And then Jesus turns to his disciples. And what does he say to them? He says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" Do you guys think Jesus is being harsh here? Or obviously we don't think he's unnecessarily harsh. But when you first read through this, does it feel like he's being harsh to anybody? Yeah, they would have sunk if they hadn't woken him up, right? Okay? The boat's literally flooding. And I love that he's asking them probably the most obvious question in the world, right? Why are you afraid? Why are you so afraid? Wouldn't they at that moment think, why do you think? Right? They're in the middle of a storm, it's flooding. Why do you think we're afraid, Jesus? But then, of course, Jesus, he says the second phrase, have you still no faith? And that's really the point here, isn't it? He's not angry at them for being afraid per se. It's more for their lack of faith. And I guess my question then becomes, how do those two things, how do they relate to each other? And we're going to see this idea of fear and faith brought up in each story as we go through them. It's kind of the theme of this section of text. So what is the relationship between fear and faith? Say that again. A lack of faith causes you to fear. You could almost say it's like on two scales where if one's high, the other's low, right? You have a high amount of fear, you have a low amount of faith. And then if you have a low amount of fear, it's because you have a high amount of faith. So is that the relationship? Anything else?
In order for them to be prepared for the things to come, they need to know Jesus. They need to trust in Him. They need to know His power. It's the same way with us. In order to be, to not be scared about things, we need to know Jesus. We need to know what He's able to do in our lives. His power.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. If they truly knew who was on the boat, would they really think it's about to sink, right? If they know who Jesus is, the more they know Jesus, the less afraid they're going to be. And if they're going to be prepared for what is going to happen in their lives, they're going to have to face down some very scary situations. And the only way they're going to get through that is through faith in Jesus and knowing who He is, right? That's the big question that's being asked in this section of Mark. And this story gives us a very profound, crazy answer, doesn't it? In fact, it's even a scary answer to the disciples. Because look at their response. It says, "And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, 'Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" It's almost as if, in fact, I think this is what it's saying, that they're more afraid after the storm is over. They're more afraid because they see that Jesus has power like they never even dreamed, right? Now, what does that mean about Jesus? Let me ask you this. What would frighten you more, the storm or Jesus? If you don't know really what's going on, and suddenly He's controlling nature itself. Now, let me ask you another question. Who has the power to control the weather? God, right? In fact, we go back and we look at passages in the Psalms, and we see this very thing brought up several times. We find out from here, Psalm 65, verses 5 through 8, it's God who has the power to still the roaring of the seas and the roaring of their waves. That's kind of one of the points of what's being said there in the psalm. This is only God has that kind of power, right? Then we have Psalm 89, verse 9. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. Talking again about God and his power. Psalm 93. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunders of many waters. Mightier than the waves of the sea. The Lord on high is mighty. Right? Only throughout Scripture, only God is the one who has this kind of power. Right? It says, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Now, this is a really cool psalm, one of my favorites, that deals with people in distress in various scenarios. But one of those scenarios is this idea of the storm and the waters. And doesn't that sound eerily familiar to what we just read in Mark? Right? I think there's an obvious point here, and that is that if we're reading Mark for the first time, and we're wondering, who is this Jesus? It's at this point we need to start really realizing the full scope of who Jesus is, right?
Because we've got the whole story.
Right.
We read it all, and sometimes I can be real hard on the disciples and say, what is wrong with you? Can't you see who he is? But it takes a while to trust somebody, and I'm not sure how long they've been with him at this time, and it does take a while to know who someone is. Now, this would be a good indication of who they have.
Right.
There, but it's kind of hard sometimes just to give them up.
That's a great point. We like to be harsh or hard on the disciples because we know the whole story. We know who Jesus is already. And so I think that's a great point, that if we try to put ourselves in their shoes, we don't know exactly how long they've been with Jesus, but it certainly seems early on, right, in the ministry. And it's going to take time, right? It's going to take time for them to fully trust him, and it's going to take time for Jesus to reveal some of these things. And another point is I think a lot of this was hidden from them purposefully, right? And so, yeah, we don't need to be too harsh on them. And that's a good point. Anybody else? So at this point, the disciples are realizing just the breadth of his power, right? They've seen him, perform miracles. But now even the wind and the sea obey him. And that's when they're asking this question, who is this guy, right? And then they get to the other side. Let's go ahead and look at chapter 5. Starting in verse 1. I'll read the first 5 verses here. It says, they came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately there met him out of the tombs a man with an unclean spirit. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. This is nightmare fuel, right? This is for someone like me, it's one of the coolest stories of the Bible. But I know if we were really there, it's definitely one of the scarier moments, isn't it? This is like a horror movie. This is terrifying. And I'm sure I'm sure there are some movies out there that have tried to draw straight from this story, and especially as we go on and we read more. But it's Mark's account that's the most vivid here. If you look at Matthew's account and Luke's account, there are actually some differences. For instance, in Matthew's account, we're told it's actually 2 men, but Mark and Luke are more focused here on the one here. And I think that's probably because of how he responds. But other details were given only in Mark and not in Matthew and Luke. We're told that this guy, they couldn't bind him anymore. We're told that he would cut himself and cry out day and night. These are very vivid details, right? And it goes back to that idea I've been trying to bring up, not only in this class, but in the video series. And that's the idea that Mark's account is very vivid. I mean, this is a very vivid account. I think we can all agree, right? Very scary. Okay? Let me ask you. You're one of the disciples. You're getting out of the boat. You're in a strange area. You're entering into the Gentile, a Gentile area. Maybe you're a little bit uneasy because of that. And suddenly these two men, right? This naked guy starts running at you. And he's got chains coming down. He's hairy. He's probably foaming at the mouth. How do you view this guy? How do you look at him? Anybody? You wouldn't look at him? Okay. You'd be running, right? Does everybody agree with that? I think we do, right? Okay. How does Jesus look at him? Jesus looks at him in a very different way, doesn't he? Look at verse 6. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you, by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. All right. This strange story gets even stranger and crazier, right? And we're already given a couple of hints as to this idea that they're in a foreign land, right? There's a herd of pigs nearby. The Jewish people would not have herded pigs. I think we understand that. They're not kosher. But anyway, here we have this man. He falls down before Jesus, which is a motif in Mark. Maybe you've noticed it already. And we're going to see it again in this story, in the following story. But people are constantly coming to Jesus and then falling before him. Just let me indulge me for a moment. Let's take a brief aside. What would that indicate about Jesus, that they're falling down before him? Royalty?
Different about him versus the people around him.
Yeah, people see that there's something different about this guy. Could it have any other indication? Could it be pointing to Jesus' deity? Perhaps. Anyway, as we go through Mark, we're going to see this idea or this motif show up over and over again. That people, when they approach Jesus and they have a need, they fall down before him. So this guy falls down before Jesus. Jesus asks him his name. He says, "Legion, for we are many." What does that mean?
Spirits within him, they knew who Jesus was and who he is.
Yeah, the spirits are the ones speaking for him at this point, right? And there's more than one. In fact, if you kind of go by the number of the pigs, then there's 2,000 demons, right? We can't know for sure how many. We just know there's a lot. How broken is this guy's life that he has thousands of demons inside of him? And they are speaking for him. Excuse me. Interesting question we just don't know the answer to. Who is it that's the one throwing himself down before Jesus? Is it the man or is it the demons? Anyway, I'll let you go ponder that one. I don't know the answer to that one. But he comes to Jesus and, well, as we just read, Jesus casts these presumably thousands of demons out of the man into the herd of pigs, and they go down into the water. What kind of power are we talking about here? Absolute power over evil, right? Notice that the demons are begging Jesus. He has full control in this moment, right? We're not shown this story of like a battle, you know how the movies do it with exorcisms, you know, there's always a battle and it's a struggle because, you know, they want to fill 2 hours. But in this moment, Jesus has full control, right? The demons are completely at his mercy and they're begging him, please let us go into the pigs. Okay, so let me ask you this. Why the pigs? What's the purpose of the pigs?
One thing is because if they're spirits and people cannot see them and they're not in human form, then it goes into some other physical form and people can see what happens to the pig, so they know that there's been something different there, so that people can see that there's, you know, a spiritual force that works there.
Okay, so that's an interesting theory. This idea that they can't see the spiritual realm, so we're given something physical to see. Okay, good.
I think another theory, the demons say, don't torment us. And I don't remember which gospel it is, but Jesus talked about the demons traveling through waterless places.
Matthew, yeah.
It's like, so maybe for them, it would be better to go into another physical thing instead of just be cast out into the water.
Right.
I've heard some very interesting theories about demons, about what the Jews thought about demons, and there's always this emphasis on water. And I've heard both. I've heard that demons don't like water; they have to stay away from water, or some, you know, weird things like that. Again, no real basis, except that there are verses that strangely mention water when demons show up. And then the other one, this is a theory I just read recently that would make sense to these stories, and that is this idea that at least to the Jewish mind at that time, they thought of demons as they associated demons with water for some reason, and so I read one commentary that basically said, when the storm takes place, when they were crossing the Sea of Galilee, there are some who would suggest that it's more than just a storm. There's a spiritual side to this storm. And they would even point to the fact that Jesus rebukes the wind, and it's the same word there as earlier when he rebukes demons. Either way, that's all speculation. But the idea here is that there's demons and water. There's some kind of relationship, and we just don't really know what it is. But it's definitely there in Scripture. But I think there's an easier point, right? That's all speculation, but there's an easier point that we can come to about the pigs, why the pigs are there. And I think that mainly it's so that there's a big incident which will get the town, you know, the towns nearby, it'll get their attention, right? And it's good evidence for the fact that these demons are out of the man, right? He could show up and be in the right mind, and they might not believe him, right? But if he's showing up in his right mind and clothed, and they hear this story about all the pigs that got killed, then there's an incident, you know, that they can look back to and say, okay, that must be the moment that this guy was cleansed, right? Did you have something, Kenny? Oh, sorry. Okay. Any questions or comments on that?
We read all through the New Testament of demon-possessed people. What would be would there be something comparable today in our society where you see the sickness?
Right.
See, that is something that I think everybody's going to have a different opinion on. But I'll tell you, I used to be much more skeptical of demons and such. Being around today, just because I thought, well, now that miracles have ceased, I kind of went along with the idea that demons aren't really possessing people so much anymore. But I would never, say that outright. But I will say I was for a class at Freed Hardeman. See, now we're going down the trail here. But anyway, at a class for Freed Hardeman, it was a counseling class. I had to witness an interview with a filmed interview with a young lady who, I can't tell you everything she did or said because it wouldn't be appropriate, but she was suffering from schizophrenia, according to the doctors, right? And she was talking about what led to that, what led to the schizophrenia. And it was actually a moment where she worshiped Satan, okay? I won't get any more detail than that, but she basically worshiped Satan, and she said from that moment on, she was hearing the voice of the devil in her head, and some other things. And it was one of the creepiest, scariest things I've ever watched. And stuff like that made me, at least, rethink some of the things we term mental illness. I think there's this idea in Scripture that mental illness and spiritual warfare are kind of one and the same. Where it's like we like to separate them off, but I don't think they're so separate. You know, we look back at Saul, King Saul, we know a spirit entered him, and some have gone back and looked at, you know, the Hebrew language, and they've said, well, I think that's actually talking about a mental illness on his part. But it's this idea in the Jewish writings that they're one and the same, that a mental illness is thought of as in the same way, you know, that there's definitely a spiritual component to it. Anyway, I can't say I have any true answers, though. Hopefully that answers your question.
The devil is the same as he was, so why shouldn't? I mean, we're seeing
Right.
perhaps even more realistically, demon Boulder, Colorado, a demon-possessed person.
Yeah.
And I mean, I accept demons.
No, I
I
certainly.
wouldn't argue against it. There's that other story of, there are many stories of evil where I look at that and I think, I wouldn't be surprised if a demon were involved here, because there's certainly there's certainly dark realms that we can't even fathom, right? I think about that guy who just murdered his family like a couple of years ago in, I think it was Colorado as well. But it was like unreal just when you looked into it. And I don't recommend anyone to do that. But it's stories like that that definitely have made me rethink it as well. But I can't say with any certainty, and some would have the theory that God, to show the power of Jesus, to show the power of his prophets and the church, he unleashed Satan a little bit, allowed him to do more than maybe he normally can. But again, this is all speculation. Anybody else want to throw their hat in the ring and say what they believe? Go ahead.
I think that in Western civilization, that we are so enamored with the medical society and the medicine doctors that we are quick to label things in a medical way.
Right.
You know, that I think in other cultures that they would label a lot of these mental illness. They would see it as a spiritual, an evil or a demon possession.
Yeah.
And even though it might be the same condition, it's just the type of labels that we put to it that differentiate.
Yeah.
I think that's a very fine point, that we like to, because of our Western culture, we like to diagnose things in medical terms. But these are all new names for old problems, right? Schizophrenia, it's not like it's brand new. It's just a new name that we've put onto it. And so, yeah, I think we definitely separate out the physical world and the spiritual world. We like pull them apart perhaps a little too much. Anything else? I'll be honest, I did not expect to go down that route, but I'm glad we did. I should have expected it. We're talking about one of the scariest demon stories in all the Bible, right? But going back into the story, this man, his life is tremendously broken, right? We can't even imagine how broken this man's life is. He's been out in the hills, naked, cutting himself, being hurt by the elements. The people of the town have tried to bind him, and they just can't do it. He has thousands, presumably, of demons inside of him. But Jesus casts them out. He has complete power over the situation. So again, we're showing a fearful situation over which Jesus has complete power. And then look at the next couple of verses here. Verse 14. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. So that goes back to my theory about why the pigs were necessary, to really get this event spreading to all the towns. It says, and people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. Why would they do that? Why would they want Jesus out of there?
They were very afraid of him.
He's getting their product. But yeah, they're afraid of him, right? Did you have anything else? Yeah, they're terrified of this guy. And no wonder, right? It's the same idea that after Jesus calms the storm, the disciples are terrified of Jesus because they've never seen anything like this before. And now, these people who have no clue who Jesus is, they see the guy they knew as the demon-possessed guy sitting there at Jesus' feet, and all of a sudden they're thinking, okay, who is this guy, right? The master's in town, so to speak. So it's definitely understandable why they would be afraid of him. But they beg him to leave. Verse 18, it says, as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might be with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This is one of my favorite little twists to the story, because now this guy's life has been put back together. He's still left with the aftermath, isn't he? Right? And he doesn't want to face it. So now we see another instance of fear. In this case, he does not want to go and face the same people who saw him in his most vulnerable, worst, right? He doesn't want to go back to them. He wants to go on and be with Jesus. But Jesus doesn't allow it. He's, in essence, making the man face his fear here. And instead of being a disciple going with him, he instead becomes a missionary. And he spreads the message to Gentiles, even before the message was fully revealed to them. So I think that's really, really cool and really beautiful that this man's life got flipped so upside down that he's now using his past as a preaching point. And so let me ask you, when have you seen, or what's the most dramatic transformation of someone's life that you've witnessed? A transformation through the power of Jesus. Have you ever seen I know I've met many preachers who were in gangs in the street. They were, they were told stories of violence and drugs and all sorts of things. And yet then there they were preaching the gospel. And I mean, that's the power of God. Amen? I mean, I think we might forget that sometimes, the true power that he has to change lives. Any other comments on this story?
I don't really have any insight into why this is, but I just want to point out the repetition in this specific story, in the little quartet story going on here, the repetition of the word beg. The demons beg him twice, and the men beg him to go away, and then the man who used to have the legion begs to come with him. It's the same word.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's once again the idea of Jesus' authority. It's showing his full authority. That's what all of these stories seem to really be pointing toward. His authority and complete control over things which terrify us. So far we've seen over the natural world and now over the spiritual world. Complete authority over both. And then as they get back across to the other side, back into Jewish land, we see that he has complete power over sickness, over a 12-year-old sickness, and then kind of to cap it all off, he has complete power over death, right? And so let's go ahead and read that. We're running out of time, sadly, but let's go ahead and read just through the end here of this chapter, and then I'll try to point some things out. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." And he went with them. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch even his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus perceived in himself that power had gone out of him. Immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. I love just this whole section we've been through, and I love how it all culminates here in this moment. Jesus, he's shown authority over the spiritual world, over the physical world, nature itself. He's shown power now over this woman's illness, but then he shows power even over death. And who has power over death but God alone? I think at this point in Act 1, as we're reading through Mark, it's at this point we have to come to the conclusion, the only conclusion, and that is that Jesus is truly from God, at least from God, and that's the least you can take it. At this point, you should hopefully be if you're reading this for the first time, hopefully you'd come to the realization this is God we're talking about here. Only God has the power over the waves. Only God has absolute power over thousands of demons. Only God has the power here to heal this woman of her disease in this way that almost seems like he's not paying attention, right? He doesn't even have to worry about it. In fact, we should point out that what is it that makes this woman different from all the other people who were touching Jesus, right? Does this mean as Jesus walks through a crowd, everyone who happens to brush shoulders, they're healed of everything? No, right? What's the difference with this woman? Her faith, right? Yeah, Jesus tells her, "Your faith is what has made you well." She had the faith enough to go to him and touch him. Then, of course, when he turns around, she falls down at his feet with fear and trembling. And I think what Jesus says to her and then what Jesus says to the people who come are really the key verses to this whole section. So please allow me to read that one more time. It says, verse 34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." I think that's such a powerful statement, and it's one of the themes here, that those who follow Jesus, we need not fear. We need only believe and have faith in him. And the more faith we have, the less fear we're going to have, and vice versa. I think there is certainly a relationship between fear and faith being presented here. He's asking this man to believe the impossible, right? He's asking this man to believe that he can raise his daughter from the dead. That's going to take quite a bit of faith. But Jesus, of course, he has power over death itself. And I think, again, we know the story, we've heard it a million times, but we should really this is the type of thing, as we're reading this book, this is the type of thing that should just floor us, right? It should still surprise us even now, the kind of power he has. Any other comments on these stories here? I want us to notice maybe one more thing, and that is the scope of the audience Jesus is now healing and helping, right? He's helping Gentiles who are naked in the wilderness with demons. He's helping little children of high-ranking officials, and he's helping outcasts like this woman with the discharge of blood. That would have made her unclean, right? She would have been an outcast for 12 years. He's healing everybody, right? It's what is it that brings these people above the rest, or what is it that differentiates them? It's their faith, right? They're willing to go to Jesus and fall before him and beg him for help. Go ahead.
And one other thing I always thought was interesting with that story is when he turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And the fact he knows who touched him. It's the same thing God did in the Garden of Eden when he asked you,
Right.
what they've done. And so I think it kind of points to, gives people the chance to willingly profess their, faith in him and things like that too, and to be honest with him and to want to follow him instead of it being forced.
Yeah, and throughout
All of these stories we just looked at, I think it's in every single one he asks a very obvious question, doesn't he? Right? At first, he's in the boat. He says, "Why are you afraid?" "Well, why do you think?" Right? And then with the demoniac, what does he say there? It might have left me. He might have not have asked something obvious there. But then with the woman, he says, "Who touched me?" Right? And the disciples just don't get this one. And then when he actually enters into the house of Jairus, he says, "Why are you guys weeping? She's not dead. She's asleep." In other words, Jesus throughout these stories has been it almost feels like to me like he's playing along, like he's messing with them a little bit, because he just has absolute control in all of these moments. And he can ask, what's going on? Why are you afraid? He just has complete control of the situation. So even though he acts as if this woman surprised him in the crowd, he's not surprised at all. Did I see another hand?
Go.
I've often thought that sometimes we're too critical of people and even the apostles. There were a lot of men out there supposedly doing miracles.
Right.
And there was magicians. These are uneducated people for the most part. So they have been fooled for many years by charlatans who claim to be Jesus and also claim to be healers. We see it today. We used to see it on television. People being healed. So it's not, the apostles were not really into Jesus being God or the Son of God. It's just that they had seen other things.
Yeah. So
If if you missed that, and for those online, I'll repeat it, that in that day and age, there were a lot of charlatans out there, a lot of people faking miracles and claiming to be the Messiah. And so it was going to take quite a bit for Jesus to differentiate himself. And if he hadn't already, these stories really set him above, right? Because here he is in complete control over all forces. All right, let's go ahead and have a prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Dear Father, thank you so much for your word. And Lord, we pray that we will continue to grow from our study of it. Lord, we thank you for the Gospel of Mark, and we pray that as we continue to read, we will read it correctly in the manner that you would have us to, with open hearts, as if we're reading it for the first time. It's in your Son's name that we offer this prayer. Amen.
Hey, look at you. You made it to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please hit the like button and the subscribe button. It really helps us out. God bless you.